Chicago Tonight, Latino Voices is made possible in part by Allstate, the Searle Funds at the Chicago Community Trust, and CIBC.
Good evening y bienvenidos to Chicago Tonight, Latino Voices. I'm Araceli Gomez Saldana, host and reporter with WBEZ. Thank you for sharing part of your weekend with us. On the show tonight, a look at how the Illinois Way Forward Act is changing the landscape for immigrants and law enforcement in Illinois. Puerto Rico is facing a massive blackout, leaving thousands without power.
We look fancy, but we're not expensive.
And local resale shops are making sustainability and saving a little more stylish. First off tonight, a sea change is coming in the way Illinois law enforcement works with federal immigration forces. In August, Governor J.B. Pritzker signed into law the Illinois Way Forward Act. Among the changes are stronger protections for immigrants and an effective discontinuation of federal detention centers in Illinois by 2022. The law also prohibits state and local governments from signing contracts with the federal government to detain immigrants, an action only one other state, Michigan, has taken. Joining us to take a look at what this means for Illinois and immigrants are Diana Rashid, a managing attorney working with the National Immigrants Justice Center's Detention Project, and Karina Denare, Director of Communications at the Interfaith Community for Detained Immigrants. Diana, I'd like to start with you. What does the new law actually change?
Well, first I'd like to talk about who it was meant to address. You know, this law is meant to protect the immigrant communities in Illinois. There are long-term lawful permanent residents who were affected by this, who were picked up by immigration at home, arrested on their way to work, and detained, as well as more recently arrived asylum seekers. Many individuals who are an integral part of the community and have U.S. citizen children, spouses, those are the communities that were affected by, that are being affected by detention in Illinois. And this bill is intended to address the fact that they should no longer be detained here in Illinois, that these counties should not profit from ongoing detention and participation in this very unjust system.
Right, so we're talking about people that have been here for a number of amount of years. On that point, in 2020, Chicago Tonight spoke with a teenager who came to the U.S. from Honduras with her father, Mayday Guzman Rivas, and her and her father were living in Crystal Lake when ICE arrested them. ICE sent her to the Pulaski County Detention Center about 400 miles away. She says no reason was given for her transfer, and she was detained for 4 months.
Y no sabemos a dónde vamos, la verdad. Entonces, cuando me movieron a Pulaski, nos ponen las cadenas en las manos, en los pies, y es bien difícil.
So we hear her testimony there. Karina, the Illinois Way Forward Act states that all immigrant detention centers in Illinois will be closed by 2022. There are 3 in the state. So what happens when they close? What happens to the people detained?
That is one thing that we are actually constantly advocating. We are advocating for the release of everyone who is in a detention center. What we have seen recently with the closure of the Pulaski County Jail was that most people were actually transferred, and they were transferred to Kankakee, McHenry within Illinois, but also some were transferred outside of the state. But really, we will continue to advocate for the release of everyone who is detained.
And Diana, part of the new law provides clarity on when law enforcement officials can and cannot enforce warrants. What does the new law clarify? And I'm really wondering what this means in practice.
Yeah, so I mean, the most important portion of the law for our purposes is really ending those contractual obligations between the counties and ICE, so that individuals are no longer going to be detained in Illinois in immigration custody. But there are protections so that counties no longer are cooperating, are no longer holding non-citizen immigrants to be turned over to ICE, and that communication aspect is prohibited as much as it can be under the law.
And when we're talking about those people, Karina, your organization is offering services to newly arrived immigrants at the Greyhound bus station. Can you tell us a little bit about that program?
For sure. Our program is called CITA. That stands for Chicago Immigrant Transit Assistance. And like you mentioned, we greet people who have arrived and are transferring to the Greyhound bus station. We see generally two populations: those who are coming to our southern border and are traveling across the country on a bus to their final destination. That can be Chicago, it can be Illinois, or it could be Wisconsin and Indiana. We also see populations of people who are currently detained in an ICE immigration detention center, whether that is in Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, or Kentucky, but they have been released. And it is in the policy of ICE to release these people at a transportation hub. That means that the Greyhound bus station in downtown Chicago is one of them. Once we meet and greet people there, we offer them any basic need items such as food, water, clothing, and even hygienic items. And we assist them to get to their final destination, whether that is buying their bus tickets or even giving them a phone and a SIM card to be able to contact their families and sponsors.
And Karina, have you seen any shift or change when it comes to immigrants and refugees coming to the Chicago area?
Yes, we have seen really recently with the reinforcement of Title 42, the Remain in Mexico policy. That affects our program directly. We know that people are still in Mexico. We know that people are still looking to seek asylum and they are still wanting to come here, but we see the numbers decrease. We have seen a number of decreased people coming through the Greyhound station within this last month, but that does not mean that people are not there, right? It does not mean that the problem has gone away. It does not mean that there is no one coming through. It means that the policy has changed.
Diana, the new law limits when local law enforcement can ask about the citizenship status or immigration status of a person in custody. How is law enforcement taking this change?
Well, we know that there are some, difficulties and challenges with some counties challenging some portions of the law. And we know that across counties and municipalities, it may differ in terms of their approach. And I think that this aspect really just has to do with education. We have a lot of education to do at the community level. This law also provides that the Attorney General has some new mechanisms to enforce the law and some vehicles for accountability so that local officials, law enforcement officials are following the law, understand the law, are educated, and can be held accountable when there are violations of that communication and those barriers that are supposed to be in place so that law enforcement is not doing the work of ICE and immigration enforcement to detain our immigrant community members.
Thank you. Our thanks to Diana Rashid and Karina Denare. Immigrants coming to Illinois to escape violence in their home countries is not a new phenomenon. In tonight's Throwback from 1985, Chicago Tonight's John Calloway met a couple who fled civil war in Guatemala and found a fragile sanctuary in Chicago.
The civil strife and political violence in Central America, particularly in El Salvador and Guatemala, have triggered an exodus of new immigrants, many of them poor and unskilled.
The majority of the people who are leaving Central America for the United States are using the overland route from Mexico and Guatemala. For the most part, they're workers, peasants. Those are the people who are coming. But those people are escaping repression, whether it be from the left or the right. They come fleeing, not looking for a future.
Maria and Juan came to this country illegally earlier this year. Their disguises are a necessity.
We use these masks to protect our families in Guatemala, because if we show our faces and the government forces there see us, our families would be assassinated immediately.
The system here is completely different from my country's. We can't get used to it. We just recently arrived, so beginning with the language, which we don't know, there are different customs here that are completely different from ours.
Maria and Juan are part of a church-based sanctuary movement that harbors illegal immigrants fleeing repression in Central America. They live in a church attic, waiting to go home.
We dream about our country, and we hope to return. If we could return today, we would go back. But as long as there is no change in the government, we cannot return.
Up next, protest in Puerto Rico over massive blackouts. Thousands of Puerto Ricans are taking to the streets to protest massive blackouts. The island's antiquated power grid has long been unreliable, and it was decimated by Hurricane Maria in 2017. This summer, officials hoped the privatization of power grid by LUMA Energy would help, but protesters are now demanding their government provide solar energy and cancel the 15-year contract with the company. Joining us to discuss the widespread outages and LUMA's takeover are Jose Lopez, Executive Director of the Puerto Rican Culture Center and lecturer at UIC's Latin American and Latino Studies Department. Richard Negrin, ComEd's Vice President of External Affairs. His team provided emergency power to Puerto Rico following Hurricane Maria. And Margaret Power, a history professor who focuses on Puerto Rico, Latin America, and gender studies at Illinois Tech. Jose, I'll go ahead and start with you. You have done a lot of outreach work in Puerto Rico, and you also have family there. Do you know about the current conditions that people are experiencing on the island?
The current conditions are really deplorable, horrible, and it's a humanitarian crisis that's informed by a colonial reality that really is what Maria, the hurricane, unveiled in 2017. When you look at the fact that many Puerto Ricans, large numbers of Puerto Ricans are senior citizens. Puerto Rico has one of the highest rates of diabetes with people needing insulin. They are facing an incredible humanitarian crisis. Puerto Rico obviously is ruled by an oversight board of which Puerto Ricans have no say-so over, an oversight board which determines the whole budget of the island, has maintained the island in a state of austerity, obviously let go of hundreds of workers from the electrical company that was publicly owned, sold this company to the highest bidder. And at the end, Puerto Ricans have not seen a single penny from that in terms of the, obviously, the energy. Puerto Rico could be self-sufficient. Puerto Rico has not only sun, but air and water, which could definitely create a new system to provide the kind of 21st century electrical, meet the 21st century electrical needs of the entire population of Puerto Rico.
And of course, that's why a lot of people are marching and taking to the streets. Margaret, I'll go to you. We know that blackouts are not uncommon in Puerto Rico, even before Hurricane Maria disrupted its power grid. Why are these power blackouts happening?
Well, they're happening because the electrical grid is in such poor shape. And I think it's going to be remaining in such poor shape because you have the people who are, the LUMA, for example, right now, the people who are running the show don't have the best interests of Puerto Ricans in mind. They have their own company corporate profits in mind. So they are quite willing to go into Puerto Rico and get paid millions of dollars, but not provide the needs of Puerto Ricans. And I just want to emphasize what Jose said. Not only does Puerto Rico have enough solar power to provide for Puerto Rican people's needs, they have enough to actually produce extra. So in terms of being people who are reliant on a foreign source for their power, they could be a people who instead produce and sell for export, which would bring in needed revenue, which would be much healthier in terms of the environment and which would be a renewable resource. And to add insult to injury, although the median income in Puerto Rico is much lower than the United States, Puerto Ricans pay more for their electricity than people in the United States do.
And Jose, we know Puerto Rico Supreme Court requested information related to the outage from LUMA. Its CEO said he does not want to comply with the ruling and says that the company should not be forced to reveal any information pertaining to LUMA's employees. Are these valid reasons? And why hasn't Puerto Rico imposed regulations on LUMA?
First and foremost, the Puerto Rican government is a colonial appendage of the U.S. government. Puerto Rico was declared by the U.S. Supreme Court in 1922 in a case, Belzer versus the people of Puerto Rico, as Puerto Rico belongs to, but it's not a part of the United States, meaning we're a piece of property of the United States, meaning that in Puerto Rico, the government has no will really to serve the people of Puerto Rico because it's a government created by the U.S. But in addition to that, you have this incredible oversight board whose executive director is paid $650,000 a year from Puerto Rican taxpayers, housing and all kinds of per diems, all kinds of security. In an island in incredible crises, this person gets all kinds of benefits and the Puerto Rican people are suffering. So there is no attention paid by this board on the needs of the Puerto Rican people.
I see. And I'll bring Richard into this conversation. Why do you think that this is happening, that the plant is causing these blackouts in customers' homes?
No, Araceli, unfortunately, we've heard the term, it's been overused, the perfect storm. That's actually what's happened here, right? You have, to Ms. Powers, to Professor Powers' statement, you have generations and generations of neglect. You have lack of resources and maintenance. The grid is a living organism. If you're not building and working on it and giving it the care and feeding that it needs, it's dying over time. So you've got this aging infrastructure in Puerto Rico. You've got, and people should not forget to talk about Hurricane Maria, 4 years ago. It never fully recovered from that. Our crews, we had, across Exelon and ComEd, literally hundreds of our crew members in large barges in our trucks that we sent over. And they were there for that restoration, which is incredibly important. But what was required was a rebuild, an entire rebuild of that grid. And that just hasn't happened. So when it's functioning at about 39% capacity, when its maintenance has been reduced by 78% over the years from where it was, you're going to have situations where you have a perfect storm like Maria, you have generations and generations of maintenance and aging infrastructure. Many of these power facilities are more than 50 years old. That's a huge problem, right? So modernization needs to happen. And you combine that with an incredibly hot, they have record temperatures, we talk about climate change, record temperatures this summer and drastically increased use. It's going to lead to a collapse like we're seeing right now. And to Jose's point, that is a serious concern, especially for some of those hard to reach areas. Puerto Rico is very different. It's not like Illinois where it's flat, right? You've got valleys, places where trucks can't get to, where folks are hiking. Many of our folks, when they were there, had to go hiking and climb big poles.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, Richard, what ComEd did, and you beat me to it, so I'm glad you talked about that. Margaret, in the little time we have left, can you tell us what needs to be done for solar power energy to happen in Puerto Rico?
Yeah, I think the expenditures of the federal government have to be massively shifted away from private corporations to community organizations, civic organizations, the people who are on the ground, who know exactly what their community needs and who are willing to put in the work to make sure that their neighbors, their families, their communities get solar power. So I think it's basically, I think their pressure needs to be put on Biden. I think go straight to the top and say, look, you talk about renewable energy. Here's a renewable energy plan that can really work. And in fact, I believe it's probably the only thing that can work for Puerto Ricans. And I just want to say, can I say one thing? It's not it's an electrical outage, but it's also an electrical outrage, what is happening to people of Puerto Rico.
Thank you. And our thanks to Jose, Richard, and Margaret for your time today. Resale is a multi-billion-dollar industry, more than $24 billion in 2018, according to research by the online resale shop ThredUp. And shopping secondhand is growing in popularity as an affordable and eco-friendly way for young fashionistas to carve out a style niche for themselves. Two shops in Logan Square are hoping they can capitalize on that trend by adding a touch of luxury to the resale experience. Producer Erica Gunderson has the story.
We look fancy, but we're not expensive.
From the gilded ceiling to the neatly arranged shoe display, everything about El Dorado Thrift Store is designed to feel like a stylish boutique. That's because Diane Villagomez and her sisters grew up in clothing their mother painstakingly shopped for in cramped, messy thrift stores, since that's what they could afford.
I remember she used to go to thrift stores for hours to maybe find a piece, maybe two. And the biggest thing of all for her, though, was to not get caught by anyone. She'd be like, okay, when someone sees you with the shirt and they like it, you just tell them you got them from this store, okay? You don't tell them you got them from a thrift store.
So when Villagomez and her family opened El Dorado in Logan Square, they wanted to create an inviting, well-organized store that anyone would be proud to shop in.
So historically, El Dorado was a hidden city, and it was thought to be completely filled with gold, right? And so that's basically what we wanted to aim for when we opened the thrift shop. We wanted to make it a little hidden nook where people can find gems.
And shoppers seem to appreciate that look and feel as much as the price tags.
For our culture specifically, it's always been about, finding those good deals, being economically feasible for the family, and it's turned out into something just fun, I think.
I started living alone about a year ago. I can't afford some of these brands straight off the rack. I don't feel shame actually going to a thrift store. Rather, I do make my own money now, but I would rather spend wisely.
They also have an ecological motivation to shop used.
I would say number one is just that kind of the sustainability aspect. I like reusing, and I also have issues with throwing things away, so I like to reuse whatever is possible, but also just kind of to spice things up.
Just a few blocks north on Milwaukee Avenue, another resale shop reaches back through time to get Gen Z kids on board with buying used.
It's become the best way to save the planet and to kind of cut back on the fast fashion, because fast fashion is actually getting more and more expensive, and kids are more and more on a budget, especially now with the pandemic, so they are thrifting like crazy.
Vintage Frills owner Jennifer Kelly curates the offerings and presents them sorted by color and era from the 60s to the 2000s. That's right, clothes from the 2000s are officially considered vintage.
What brings them here a lot of times is the streetwear that I offer, the t-shirts, the baggy dad jeans or mom jeans as they call them. I got real mom jeans. They're worn by real moms, okay? And vintage frills. And they love urban streetwear in particular. So I try to scout that out a lot for them because they weren't born. That's the honest truth.
Vintage enthusiasts also say the construction of vintage clothing beats the pants off fast fashion.
The uniqueness of the pieces, the quality of the clothes. I've noticed when I vintage shop and I look at tags inside the clothing, a lot of the clothing was made in America, union-made clothes, and they were just made very well.
And best of all, when that cozy grandma sweater that was made to last makes its way to you, now you're part of its story.
When you reuse things, you add on to the memories of like old parts of clothing that like used to be part of someone else's wardrobe at some point in time. So it's pretty nice.
Again, that was producer Erica Gunderson. And if you love vintage but don't love leaving the couch, both El Dorado and Vintage Frills allows shoppers to reserve featured items through their Instagram accounts. You'll find more on that on our website. And that's our show for this weekend. Be sure to check out our website, WTTW.com/news, for the very latest from WTTW News, including a newly proposed ward map by City Council's Latino caucus. And if you're watching us on Saturday night, you can now also watch us and Latino Voices and Black Voices on Sundays beginning at 10 p.m. And you can catch me hosting Weekend Edition Saturday and Sundays, as well as my reporting during the week on 91.5 WBEZ. Next week on Latino Voices, Alex Hernandez with Univision will be here in the host chair. Now, from all of us here at Chicago Tonight, Latino Voices, I'm Araceli Gomez Saldana. Thank you for sharing part of your weekend with us. Stay healthy and stay safe. Buenas noches.
Closed captioning is made possible by Robert A. Clifford and Clifford Law Offices, a personal injury law firm dedicated to preserving the dignity and rights of all individuals.